good to see you too. I know.
I'm beginning to think. Yes, I'm beginning to think. Thoughts become me.
Welcome to The Cost of Not Paying Attention, hosted by nationally recognized speaker Janine Hamner Holman. Janine knows what it takes to attract and retain world-class talent. Join her here each week on The Cost of Not Paying Attention as we use brain science, leadership, management, and real-life challenges managers face to explore the places where we aren't paying attention.
Welcome to The Cost of Not Paying Attention. I'm your host, Janine Hamner Holman. What am I paying attention to today? So I came across a quote, which is about how human beings, all of us, what we are constantly seeking in our lives is safety, belonging, and dignity. And I thought that that was such a perfect encapsulation of a lot of things that are going on in the world today and in the world of work, but also in our lives. We've all been living through this COVID-19 pandemic and are now getting sort of into the place where things are a little bit more, I don't know, normal-ish. And yet we are still looking for safety, belonging, and dignity, because that's what we're wired to do. And safety in particular has been one of those things that's been hard to come by because there's been so much in flux and so much uncertainty. And which connects very closely to belonging, because when we don't feel like things are safe, are firm, it can be also hard to feel like we know where we fit in, which then also connects to dignity, feeling like we are respected, feeling like we know what we're up to, feeling clear on what's going on. And so this has been a challenging time for us humans, and it's been a hard time for organizations because of this constant flux. Here's one of these things that is an unfortunate reality, is that all of the really smart people who study this stuff say that, aside from COVID-19, the amount of uncertainty, the amount of change, the pace of change, it's going to continue to be like it has been. And so our opportunity as humans who are constantly on the hunt for safety, belonging, and dignity, it's going to be really important for us to figure out how to both get clear about what is and learn some new skills around resilience so that we can weather all of this today. Which brings me right to our guest. Alyssa Gioscia is a certified executive coach and talent development professional. She has got a real passion for guiding people toward bringing their dreams to life and accomplishing things that they think are impossible. I love that. And I love her, and you guys are going to get to experience why. She is passionate about getting to the heart of people's stories and partnering with them to produce powerful legacies. Welcome to the show, Alyssa.
Thank you, Janine. I'm happy to be here.
Yay, I'm so glad that you're here. It feels like it was, ages ago that we set this up, but finally here we are.
I was thinking the same thing, but we're here now.
Amen. So I'm going to start the way that I often do, which is tell me what is something that you have become aware of that we are not paying enough attention to? And what is the cost in your wisdom of that inattention?
Yeah, for me right now, one of the big things that I think we're not paying enough attention to is grief and how we process it. And
Mm.
to me, the cost is the unhealing. Like we think we've healed from something and we haven't.
Uh-huh.
And grief has an interesting way of sort of morphing into other things like anger, rage, negative emotions that just kind of sit at the bottom of your stomach, at your feet, and then it
Mhm.
fuels other things. So when you're having another emotional moment, instead of it being only about the thing that you're addressing, it's fueled by all of this unresolved grief that has turned into anger that's sitting in there. And so when I'm going on my own personal journey, I've hit a lot of different moments where I've like, oh, there's something there to grieve, but I think it's something we miss a lot. And I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of rules around grief that are not actually correct that we think we have to go through that don't actually help us close the loop.
Oh my gosh, there's so much there to unpack, and
So,
that's brilliant. And so I think where I want to start
mhm,
is when you're thinking about grief and with the folks who you help sort of create enormous breakthroughs so
mhm,
that they can soar and create what they're up to creating in their own lives. When we think about the things that we're not grieving fully,
mhm,
in part, are those like the things that happen in our lives about which we have sadness and grief? So
mhm.
we just had to let go of our 16-year-old dog
Um,
in
yeah.
January, and that was incredibly sad, and there was a lot of grief around that. Or are you also talking about, as we are living in these dynamic times of today, grieving the way that things used to be, or what we used to be able to do, or how things used to work, or D, all of the above?
Yeah, D, all of the above. Like as you were talking, I was thinking just yes, because it's very easy to tie grief to death, which is the main thing that we think about when we're thinking, I need to grieve this person, this pet, this thing, whatever it might
Mhm.
be. We often tie it to that, but there are so many other things that we need to grieve because of the unmet expectation or the story we were telling ourselves of how it would be, could be, should be.
Mhm.
All of those ideals or dreams have a moment where they can be grieved. And that's everything we're dealing with. The job I thought I would have, the fact that I got laid off, the way my business is going differently than when I thought, maybe not good, bad, or otherwise, but just differently.
Yeah.
The loss of a friendship, a relationship, an actual person in your life. So there are so many areas. And like if I say to a client, like, have you grieved the loss of that job? It almost doesn't connect because it's like, well,
Mhm.
a person didn't die. So why am I grieving? But there's so much opportunity to address basically the unresolved feelings about the situation and how it looks different than what we thought it would look like.
And there's so much in our lives
Mhm.
that don't turn out like we thought they would, right? The
Nothing. That never
nothing.
happens.
Exactly. The life that I thought I would be living now when
Exactly.
I was, 5 or 10 or 20 or
Mhm.
30
Yeah.
has no relationship to the life that I am in fact
No.
living.
And even in
Um,
the way that life is going right now, if you asked anyone in November or December what their life would be like in April versus everything that happened in December and January to what they're actually answering now, it's
mhm.
completely different. Even for myself, the same thing. Like if you asked me in December what I would be doing now, it would not be what I am actually doing now.
Yeah.
And that's a big shift for most people.
And so is part of it also that we humans, we tend to get very hooked by how we think things should go,
Yes.
how this conversation should go, how this relationship should go, how our children should be, how
Mhm.
our business should be, how our career path should be. Is that part of what's tripping us up as well? Is that we get
Mhm.
hooked into this should, which then gets tied to an expectation of how
Yes.
it's supposed to go.
100%. We love to fill in the blanks, right? Because we don't like uncertainty, because that's
Right.
where our brain thinks there's some kind of danger there. So if I know A and D and F, I'm like, okay, well, I need to fill in B and C and close the gap there. So it's a lot of that. And all of my clients would say they've heard me say should or shouldn't, what is.
Yeah.
Because, well, I should call that person, or I should do this. Let's take that off the table. What do you want to do? What will move you forward in a way that makes sense based on what we're talking about? But oftentimes the should is something that we're trying to force ourselves into that we don't actually want to do, or even intuition wise may not be right.
Mhm.
And there's also a balance of saying, okay, what am I doing where I'm just trying to avoid or procrastinate? And what am I trying to force myself into that's not right for me
Mhm.
because it worked for somebody else, or there's a story that I'm telling myself.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. So I had a mentor a while ago who used to always say, "Stop shoulding on yourself." And I thought it was
Yeah.
I thought it was funny.
It's funny.
And I thought it was so perfect because
Yeah.
that is what we do. We create these expectations and
Mhm.
shoulds, and then we put them on ourselves, and it lives often like something that we have to do,
Correct.
something that if I were a better fill in the blank, if I were a better wife, if I were a better mother, if I were a
Right.
better employee, if I were a better business owner, if I were a better consultant, if I were a better, the list just goes on and on. If I were a better whatever, I
Mhm.
would be doing this thing. So clearly I'm supposed to do it. So I should.
Right. Right.
And it may have no relevance, as you were saying, to
Mhm.
what would be good, profitable, smart, in my best interest,
Yes.
authentic for me.
Right. I love what you said, authentic. And I like what you said too, like we wear it as a hat. We take that and we wear it as if it is reality, one and done, and that's it. When it's simply one way, it could go, may go, very well may not go. And so, having that open-handed versus I should do it. It's very white knuckle. Like I'll say that to my clients, like, are you like, I gotta do this?
Mhm.
Or can we open it up and say, is that profitable? Is that best for me? That's why with clients too, it's helpful to have the vision, because if we're clear on your vision and where we're going, we can look and say, is this actually moving you forward towards that? Or is it just something you think you should do for some reason? And, sometimes it's even helpful to say, like, if that didn't exist tomorrow, what would you do? Because it can also open up your mind to things change very rapidly.
Yeah, I love that. And so if we realize that we have a should, or we have a didn't go like I wanted it to go, or I thought it was going to go, and we have some residual emotions, sadness, grief, that could be processed around that. What are the places for us to look or to dive in to start moving through that?
Yeah, one of the tools that I like to use with clients is the Grief Recovery Handbook.
Hmm.
It's been an interesting tool. For me, it allowed me to close the loop on whatever the thing is, and it's an interesting experience because, like, I'll share a personal. So my mom passed away when I was in my early 20s, and at the time, thank you. I was young. Most people in my life hadn't lost a grandparent, let alone a parent. So there were people who were much older than me because they had been living life and have experienced that. But at the time, no one my age really knew what to say or what to do. So there was the normal feelings of like, you got to get over it. You got to keep moving forward. Life does not stop. And of course you feel sad, but you keep going. And it wasn't until much later when I started looking at the process, like there's no actual timeline. And the thing that I like, particularly for me with the Grief Recovery Handbook, is it allows you to have all of the emotions because, my mom was ill. So it wasn't something where it's like I could direct my anger at a specific situation or and someone kind of brought up to me like, well, are you angry? And I'm like, well, I can't be angry about it. Like it wasn't our choice. But this process allowed me to have all the emotions. And I think sometimes for clients or for just humans, there are certain things we cut ourselves off on, like, I have to move on. I have to feel sad for a certain amount of time and then that's it. Or I can't feel certain ways. And so I really like that tool because it closes the loop on anything and everything you might be feeling about a situation, because it's when we don't allow ourselves to feel all the things that it goes unresolved, even though we think it might be addressed.
I love that. And Chaz, can you pop up the grief graph that we found? Yeah, so I love this. when I was doing research for our conversation today, we've heard of the 5 stages of grief. And so we think we're supposed to move through them in a sequential order.
I love
and this. as the experience you got shows, we don't. We move back and forth and around in circles and, over to acceptance and then back to anger and because that's how it goes. Thanks, Jess.
Yeah. And you may never hit bargaining, for example, or you might never hit denial based on how you're processing at the time. But all of those loops and whirls, it's definitely not linear. And that's the other thing too, is to give yourself grace if you need to like go back, because you're not really doing that. You're simply on the journey. And as with anything in our type of work, like sometimes I'll say to my coach or even my therapist, like, haven't we talked about this already? Like what? But
can I put that to bed?
Yes. But as you get deeper, it comes up. Now, maybe when it first came up, it was a 10 and now it's a 7 and then it's a 3. So it's different. But to not be upset about the fact that something's being addressed again, because as you clean things out and clear your mind and heal, different parts of it appear, and it has to be okay to deal with each part when it comes, because you probably couldn't have dealt with that version of it, let's say 6 months ago or 3 months ago when the first part of it came up.
I love that way of thinking about it, that, that we're moving through stages and sort of like an onion, like there's different layers to it. And so that it keeps coming up isn't a problem. It's That's just like, oh, great. Now I get to deal with this layer of this thing that happened, or this the situation in which I found myself, or whatever the thing was.
Yeah. And sometimes something will trigger it, like, ooh, I'm feeling a little weird about this. Oh, you know what? That reminds me of this. Yeah. So now it's like, okay, so let me deal with this feeling now. But I think the biggest thing too is taking ourselves off that timeline, because that beautiful, lovely, straight arrow is just not how life works, or how healing works. It's not how grief works. And giving ourselves the freedom to experience what we're experiencing in the moment and address it in the moment is key.
So I have a mentor who used to, or she probably still does, talk about how in her image, in her mind, we are all walking around in one half of a Velcro suit. So, if you think about Velcro, it's loops and hooks.
Yes.
And so we are all walking around in a loop suit.
Okay.
And occasionally we keep getting hooked by that same thing. Yes. Like, oh man, I thought I dealt with the fact that my grandfather was a jerk. And now here I am again dealing with the fact that my grandfather was a jerk. And it's just one of those things that keeps coming around because we're in a human loop suit.
Well, yeah, that's a great analogy. And yeah, like I said, there are things that I can address now. Like we start off and we have a hammer and we're hitting a nail, right? Later, we might be doing the thing with I'm chiseling this little piece of dirt out of this beautiful sculpture with a little brush. And it's that tiny little, artifact hammer that you might be using. Right. It's different. And so it's okay to say, I couldn't have even seen that little piece if I didn't use the hammer before.
Right.
And the way then too that it occurs to us is a lot less painful. It's like, okay, this is a little thing and I don't want the pebble in my shoe, even the grain of sand, because I will feel it, but it's not a boulder.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes it easier to deal with it.
Absolutely. As I was doing research for our conversation today, one of the things that I came across was this idea of a sixth stage of grief. So thank you, Chaz. So, this is really about finding meaning and finding meaning in
Mhm.
whatever it is that we are grieving. Thanks, Chaz. So, whether what we're
Mhm.
grieving is the loss of a person or a pet or a
Mhm.
being that we loved, or what we're mourning is the loss of a situation or a situation that was familiar. Maybe even it wasn't
Yeah.
that great, but we knew how to function. I mean, I remember I
Mhm.
worked for a Fortune 200 company. There were things about it that were awesome, and there were a lot of things about it that were bad. And when
Mhm.
I left, I realized, or not a good fit for me. When I left, I realized, like, oh, I have grief in the loss of this,
Mhm.
even though in many ways it was a really poor fit for me. But I knew how to do it. I
Yeah.
knew I was comfortable. So back to that, we're always seeking safety and dignity and belonging. I knew where I belonged. I felt
Mhm.
safe there. I was respected,
Yeah.
and then I lost all those things.
The comfort will keep us in place for a very long time.
Yeah,
And, it's hard when you get laid off, for example, it's hard to find meaning in that and be like, it's a positive. And we can say, okay, this happened. So now what do I want to do with it?
right.
But that's where I think having all the emotions come into play, because the loss of a parent that you had a horrible relationship with or who was absentee can be a hard thing to process,
Right.
because we can judge ourselves like, I should feel sad, I don't feel sad, or like, I'm glad they're gone, and like, well, shoot, I don't want to feel that like,
Right.
so
I
that
shouldn't feel
I
that way.
shouldn't feel that way, right? And
Right.
it's like, well, let's have the feelings as they are and say all the things, and not judge the process or how we're feeling. But it's very easy to shame out around what or how you're feeling.
So when we find ourselves
Mhm.
shaming out, and I
Mhm.
love, I've never heard that formula. I love that, shaming out about
Mhm.
something. How can we pull ourselves back, or what ideas do you have around
Mhm.
how we can get regrounded in what is?
Yeah, well, and this oftentimes I will even use like the Byron Katie framework. Is it true? Right.
Mm,
So let's say a parent died and there is a negative relationship. Well, I shouldn't feel bad. I shouldn't feel relieved that they're gone. Well, is that true?
mhm,
And you do feel that way.
right.
So it's not I should or shouldn't. That is how you feel. So let's talk through why and how you feel that way. And this is why, like for me, I always let my clients know I work with a coach, I work with a therapist. I encourage my clients to do the same. You want other people to kind of help you walk through it. But that's where something like the grief recovery handbook or going through that process comes into place, because you can have all the feelings. You can talk about the things that you want to acknowledge for yourself, the things that you liked about the person, because there was probably one or two things you remember that you want to talk about, and the things that you're not happy with. But truly being able to say all the things helps us from going down a rabbit hole. And I do really feel like it, asking myself, like, is it true that I should or shouldn't feel this way? It's simply how you feel. So let's acknowledge that and not put any judgment around it.
Yeah, I love that. So, Chaz, can you pull up New York Times One? When we were looking at all of this, I came across this, and I loved this
Mhm.
beginning here around coping strategies, because it says there at the beginning of the second paragraph, grief does not follow a schedule,
Mhm.
and American culture expects people to mourn quickly,
Yes.
to cry at the funeral, and then have a sense of closure, and then move on. And thanks, Chaz. And like
Mhm.
that's not how many of us, I mean, even if what we're dealing with is sadness and not grief, different
Mhm.
different
Yeah.
entities, um we don't move through it that way. And like there's a lot of cultures,
Mhm.
you know, the Jewish culture has some wonderful traditions around grieving.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a culture, I think it's an African culture, where people who are mourning the loss of a loved one,
Mhm.
any sort of loved one, they wear a band on their arm for a year,
Mhm.
because the expectation is it's going to take you at least a year, and you
Yeah.
want to have something public so that people know I get to be a little extra kind to this
Mhm.
person
Right.
because they are going through a grieving process.
Yeah, I mean,
And
to me, it's like waves, don't you think?
yeah, we were talking about waves before we
Mhm.
started, and I mean the ocean, as you can tell, the ocean is one of my grounding places, and part of what I love about the ocean is the movement and
Mhm.
the repetition and the fact that it's never the same. You know, waves come in sets, and sometimes they come
Mhm.
in sets of one and sometimes in sets of four, and there's an unpredictability
Yeah.
in the regularity. There's an unpredictability,
Mhm.
um, and so you know, I love bringing that idea, as you just did, to the concept of grief.
Yeah, and I know for me, like there have been years where a birthday or a specific holiday doesn't trigger any specific emotions, but seeing a flower at the store on a random Tuesday
Yeah,
can.
right.
And because you sort of never know when or how it will come or what extent, sometimes depending on other things, it might hit me extremely hard. And other times it's just like a, you know, a moment, a reminder, and all
Mhm.
of those are okay. But even to your point too, and that article said it beautifully, the hard line of grief, that newness that happens right away, that gets easier, it subsides. But I don't know, depending on what the loss is, in certain instances, that it ever really goes away. It simply changes. And
Mhm.
that's the other piece that I think we get wrong, is that it's going to have an end point. It just stops and it's never again.
Yeah.
It will feel different, it will change, but you know, depending on the loss, that you're not letting go of the person, the memories, et cetera, the relationship, the things that molded you about the time together.
Yeah. You know, and I find it so funny. I have a close friend who passed away. We're coming up on the 1 year anniversary
Mhm.
from cancer, and I had the thought the other day, oh, I need to call Kirsten.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, I can't call Kirsten.
Mhm.
She's not here anymore. Um, and and so, I mean, you know, one of the things I love this concept that has been um, coming up a lot around work that people have been doing around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging,
Mhm.
especially with the belonging piece of
Mhm.
that, is the idea that everyone's life is a movie in progress.
That's right.
And where I come into, you know, so you and I got connected maybe 6 months ago now. Um,
Might have been a year at this point. I lose track, Janine.
I know, yeah, time is very
Yeah.
funny these days. Yeah, so you know, 6 months to a year ago,
Yeah.
and something will happen,
Mhm.
and you will pop into my brain,
Mhm.
and you know, 100 years down the road. Well, 100 years down the road, neither one of us will be here, but you know, things happen in life, and people come and go,
Mhm.
and circumstances change, and circumstances come and go, and I think I think one of our collective opportunities is to remember that where we're coming in on anybody else's movie
Mhm.
is very much partway through.
Yes.
And so we don't know all of the things that have happened beforehand. And so, you
Mhm.
know, if you and I are in Austin together, which would be awesome, and we're in the grocery store and suddenly you tear up over a can of tomatoes. Like, it's not that you suddenly had a stroke and lost your mind. Like, probably that can of tomatoes is connected to something
Yeah.
that I don't know about. And so, like, having that patience, having that compassion, having that knowing that I came into Alyssa's story, 30 years after it started. I think when we can all have that level of both connection and compassion for each other, and not knowing the background of anybody else's story, it feels like it would be easier maybe for us to manage our feelings and manage our grief.
I think so. There's a level of empathy and curiosity that we don't always come at others with, because, we're the star in our own movie, like you said. So we're thinking about the way everything is coming towards us versus looking at that person or that moment in its own individual, like, what's happening here now? Right. Oh, Alyssa's Italian. She makes sauce with her mom. It reminded her of that for whatever reason, right? It's something totally sideline. Is getting curious and being open and learning to not be afraid of the uncomfortable or the emotions of somebody else, because that makes many of us feel very uncomfortable. Like, I don't know what's going on right now, but this person's crying, right? What's happening? So just the curiosity, and even to do the other thing that's very uncomfortable, which is to hold space and keep just the silence.
I love that. The opportunity to hold space for another person, is a wonderful thing, and something that we often bulldoze over. Last night, my husband and I were having a conversation, and he was having a number of feelings about something, and it did not make sense to me why he was having those feelings. So I was trying to help him reframe the story that he was creating, because all the feelings he was feeling were negative. And I was like, well, what about or could you change the story such that, and that wasn't what he needed.
Yeah.
And eventually he was able to say, I just need you to say, I'm sorry. I was like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I did such a bad job at that. So tell me again. And we got to do a little do-over.
Yeah.
Because really what he needed was just compassion in that moment for the feelings that he was feeling.
Right.
He didn't
And
need
we want to understand, right? So I definitely can relate to what you say, because in order to be with you fully in the moment, I need to understand exactly what we're talking about, and to remind myself, I don't need to understand. I'm simply here for and with this person, which I think for me, probably for you, is one of the cool things about coaching, is being able to hold that space and saying, this is a safe space to say the things that you maybe can't say anywhere else. And would just feel the feelings, like what's going on. Because, you can kind of see sometimes when somebody has a shift, and it's like, okay, what's going on there? And just to let them articulate it or not.
And, we are in this business time here in the 21st century where managers are expected to be coaches. People don't want a boss. They want a coach. And so helping to create that space for people. I was working with a client the other day who manages a large law firm, and she was saying it just takes so much time. Like, it's so, oh my God, it's so frustrating. And and so I was holding space for her to have her feelings around that, and I said, I get it. I get it that it does. It was way easier when we could say, I don't care about you. I don't, just produce the work that I need done and then go home. But that is no longer the nature of work. And when we show up that way, we lose our people. Yeah. And we are in a time when the war for talent is real. And, finding the right people and getting them onboarded and keeping them around is the name of the game for most organizations. And so, I get it. It takes a lot of time, and sometimes it sucks having to really care about all of your employees and hold that space for them. And we get to grieve that. We get to grieve that it is no longer the way that it used to be. I get it that stinks, and here's what it is. And so then how do we move into that space with power and with compassion for ourselves and ultimately for our people?
Well, and for me, being in the corporate space for 20 years, even when I was first in it, it was not like that. Like whatever was going on at home, you kept that to yourself and you put on your game face at work. And I have appreciated being in corporate while that shifted and seeing it shift, because there's an authenticity that you cannot bring if you're keeping a very large part of yourself out of the workplace. So being able to come in the throes of life, which we are all living, which happens to all of us, and be able to have that understanding too is really helpful, because otherwise you're getting some version of the person, but you're probably not getting their best. And then also you don't even have the understanding as to why you're not in a certain moment if something's happening.
Right. Yeah. And what we as organizational leaders need is the best from our people.
That's right.
Whether those people are us or the people who are working with and for us. And so, creating space for people to be fully themselves, I think is critical.
I would agree.
Alyssa, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your generosity and your insights about grief and the opportunities for us to move through them more fully. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Janine. It was a pleasure. I love talking with you. So I'm glad I could share, and thanks for having me.
Back at you, babe. I am Janine Hamner Holman, and this has been The Cost of Not Paying Attention. Remember, great leaders make great teams. Until next time.
On behalf of Janine Hamner Holman, thanks for paying attention. This has been The Cost of Not Paying Attention. Head on over to our website, www.janinehamner.com/podcast, for access to the show notes as well as additional resources. Remember, great leaders make great teams.